Just to say that how Buddhism is unique, we often say that the Buddhism is scientific, therefore it is unique. Okay? And if it is scientific, then I believe that, then it is not, religious enough, I must say. But Baba Sahib, on the other hand, try to say that the Buddhism is religion. He uses the word religion. And if someone says he uses the word religion in the context of Dhamma, then that is also very wrong, because if you read some of his speeches, specifically his speeches in Kathmandu and also his speech in BHU, 25th November in 1956, he delivered a speech on Buddhism in BHU, Banaras Hindu University. Prabuddha Bharat, Ambedkar's Buddhist Rashtra, the nation. So is there something called a Buddhist Rashtra nation that, when Baba Sahib talk about Prabuddha Bharat, so generally, people, popularly translate the very concept of Prabuddha Bharat as enlightened India. Means, some people say scientific India, that everyone believes in science, everyone believes, in logic, in rationality, all of that. Now, I argue that this is not what exactly Baba Sahib was trying to say. He argues that many times that the Buddhism stand very close to science, as he refers Narsu. Narsu takes, and Narsu was a scientist who actually, present Buddhism, in the form of, the let's say the ancient science. But apart from that, Baba Sahib is also someone who believes in the very concept of religion, believes that how religion play a very important role. And when I'm saying the religion, so religion in very popular sense, not in the context of India, but in the context of West, where he refers Emile Durkheim and other scholars who basically emphasize the role of religion in the smooth functioning of everyday life, state and society. For this new beginning in JNU, Buddhist Student Forum, and that finally we have a Buddhist organization in JNU too. When actually I was activist scholar in JNU, it was a different time, and I believe that it was difficult for some of us to even imagine to have something called, the Buddhist Student Forum. So I'm happy that finally we have a Buddhist Student Forum here, and I'm really happy and glad that we are celebrating Buddha Purnima, Buddha Jayanti in JNU. So yes. Most of you must be sitting here from morning and listening different scholars and people who are working on Buddhism. This sir delivered a very informative and very detailed talk, I must say, on the rise and the decline of Buddhism in South India. And ma'am also spoke about the women and Buddhism, and I was not present for other speaker in the morning, Alone sir, but I am very sure because I have been listening. We have been listening them, from really long time in JNU. So I'm very sure they must have enlightened you, must have provided you a lot of information about Buddhism. Now my talk is is little different. Maybe not very well developed. My arguments you may sound very immature or naive, and this the proposition or the argument that I'm going to make may also sound little provocative, but this is what I believe, and this is what even during my PhD I found certain things. In my PhD is on post Ambedkar, the Dalit leadership in Vidarbha. My MPhil was on Maharashtra, but Vidarbha became my case study in my PhD. And I also try to understand Buddhist leadership, Buddhism after Ambedkar, and how it actually shaped. So yes, I'll begin with that. As my the topic of my talk is Prabuddha Bharat, Ambedkar's Buddhist Rashtra, the nation. So is there something called a Buddhist Rashtra nation that, when Baba Sahib talk about Prabuddha Bharat, so generally, people, popularly translate the very concept of Prabuddha Bharat as enlightened India. Means, some people say scientific India, that everyone believes in science, everyone believes, in logic, in rationality, all of that. Now, I argue that this is not what exactly Baba Sahib was trying to say. He argues that many times that the Buddhism stand very close to science, as he refers Narsu. Narsu's takes, and Narsu was a scientist who actually, present Buddhism, in the form of, the let's say the ancient science. But apart from that, Baba Sahib is also someone who believes in the very concept of religion, believes that how religion play a very important role. And when I'm saying the religion, so religion in very popular sense, not in the context of India, but in the context of West, where he refers Emile Durkheim and other scholars who basically emphasize the role of religion in the smooth functioning of everyday life, state and society. So from that juncture, from that reference point, I'm also trying to understand that what exactly Baba Sahib meant. And the discussion can go further, we can disagree, agree. But my interest is to know more about that, how Baba Sahib, if he believed in the very idea of religion and the very core belief, not that simply saying that, because now we also have things to say, just to say that how Buddhism is unique. We often say that the Buddhism is scientific, therefore it is unique. Okay, and if it is scientific, then I believe that then it is not religious enough, I must say. But Baba Sahib, on the other hand, try to say that the Buddhism is religion. He uses the word religion. And if someone says he uses the word religion in the context of Dhamma, then that is also very wrong, because if you read some of his speeches, specifically his speeches in Kathmandu and also his speech in BHU, 25th November in 1956, he delivered a speech on Buddhism in BHU, Banaras Hindu University. So if you read some of his speeches and some of his writing, so he's very traditional in the sense of understanding the very concept of religion. Therefore, for him, the religion is not simply saying that the religion is scientific enough, but religion is also about the morality. So I have written some some texts that I'm going to read in front of you. So yes, in my PhD fieldwork in the Vidarbha region of Maharashtra, I encountered two contrasting assertions regarding the role of Buddhism in everyday lives of Dalits. The first assertion, claiming Buddha is our God, Baba Sahib gave us, we are not Hindu, was prevalent among poor and illiterate Dalits in slums and villages. The second assertion, emphasizing Buddhism as a way of life without defying Buddha, or like without saying that the Buddha is God, was more common among educated, middle class and urban, upwardly mobile Dalits. Interestingly, the ritualistic practices of birth, marriages and death ceremonies in the context of New Buddhism were predominantly found among working class converted Dalits, while the educated and middle class Dalits were more drawn to popular notion of Buddhism such as meditation, self-awareness and nirvana. These ideas seem more aligned with Western interpretation of Buddhism. It appears that this notion of Buddhism in the present time have become central to Western form of Buddhism. Although the educated middle class consider Buddha as a guide rather than a god, as I said, there seems to be surplus attraction of Buddha, creating a sense of divinity between these meditation practitioners and Buddha. So for instance, if you go in slums, like I come from a slum and I know in my basti, from birth to death, even like, I don't know what you call, like Padna, I don't know what you call in Hindi or English, when there is a birth ceremony. So there is a song of Buddha and Ambedkar. Okay, so from birth to death ceremony, there are rituals which includes Buddhism, and you find this ritualistic presence of Buddhism mostly among poor and illiterate Dalits. As I said, the educated upwardly mobile Dalits, you find them mostly Saturday, Sunday, somewhere in the Vipassana center or in meditation center, and they consciously make this effort that Buddha is not a god. But if you sociologically, if someone observes as an observer the gathering of meditation practitioners, there is this gap, and that gap is a divine gap. That somewhere when you meditate in front of Buddha or thinking about Buddhist meditation, you also have in your conscious mind that the Buddha carries some divinity, which is a surplus for us. That I don't have it, you don't have it, Buddha have it. And this surplus somewhere work as a divine. If someone says that the poor Dalit going in front of Buddha, praying, or praying in front of Baba Sahib, saying Baba Sahib is our God, the educated man or educated people may say that, oh, you are making God out of Ambedkar or God out of Buddha. But on the other hand, this meditation practitioner or the educated mob, I must say, when they say that the Buddha is not God, but they cannot disapprove that there is something divine that they consider. For instance, I do not, for instance, there is a love. I don't remember where exactly Baba Sahib said, but he mentioned that why you see the huge, statues of Buddha, compared to other so-called God in the world. For instance, if one reads the history of Afghanistan, the entire, you also come to know that how bigger the Buddhist statue was. So he also refers the very idea of love, that when you love someone, then you have the image of that person, something very big, something very huge. You can't compare that image, and therefore you go and create a very huge, big image. That's what happened with the Buddha, the love for the Buddha. But on the other hand, when you have contempt for someone, you reduce that person to nothing. As I said, when you have love for someone, you make that person very big, and when you have contempt for someone, you make that person very, very, very small. And that's what even happened with the Buddhism. Now, that is another debate where Baba Sahib talk about the contempt and how the very concept of contempt gave birth to the very concept of untouchability in India. Okay, so but that is another debate altogether. Here I am trying to emphasize that when this educated middle class or upwardly mobile Dalit argues that the Buddha is not God, and they still consider Buddha something as divine, I argue there is something surplus is there, and that surplus works very nicely to basically for this meditation practitioner. So yes, as I said, this trend is also very close to what we call the Western form of Buddhism, which Baba Sahib was quite against, if you read his Buddha or Karl Marx very closely. This trend resembling a post-material capitalist consumption of emotional need. One can note this. In Western spiritual circle, Buddhism often serves as a post-ideological way of life, without forming an organized religion or countering dominant ideologies. In more classical sense, what Nishitani, a Japanese Buddhist scholar who was also the student of Heidegger, argued in the context of emergence of new self in a Western society in a post-war era. So, Nithani, he argues that how in the Western society, the new self emerged in the post-war era, because when there is some kind of, let's say, you have a consent, between the ideology that now there will be no war. Or for instance, if you have met your material need, now next what? This question of what next what basically also leads to the mental discontent. Okay, so I also argue in the last that how for few people the Buddhism, mostly for elite across the caste and across the religion and also across the region, Buddhism for many becomes the discontent of a mind. However, Baba Sahib present Buddhism, or like let's say the conversion of Buddhism of poor working class masses that you see in the Gujarat, that we have witnessed in Delhi and Maharashtra and elsewhere, that the working class Buddhists are converting in collective manner. They are not someone who have a time, good enough time to go and sit in front of Buddha for 2 hours or 1 hour, even to spend a day for a meditation or vipassana. Therefore, for them, the discontent is social discontent. It's a collective material discontent which lead them towards the Buddhism. And therefore, reducing Buddhism mostly to the mind and not to the material is, I believe, something very problematic. So, as I said, this Buddhist scholar Nishitani, he argued that in the post-war era, the new self developed in the Western society. So the one self, he says, is the observing self, which is the self that sees, and the other self is a seen. That one is the observer self and one is the observed self, and both are separate. So and this observed self or observer self, if one basically someone is coming from psychology or someone is studying a mind for that matter. There are different scholars, philosophers who have studied the mind. There is this, observer self is there. So autobiographer, when they talk about themselves, is mostly you can see they observe themselves. So there is this observer self. You always have an observer self. When you sit and think about your life, you always use this concept of observer self. You observe yourself and observe others. You contemplate. So contemplation is mostly what Nithani says is observer self. And what you observe, when you observe your own self, when I observe my own self, he says, is observe self. Okay, that is again the very long debate that, so I'll leave that part. Yes. So actually, as I was saying, the self, here the self is compelled to be, okay, sorry. So yes, so this new self that we see mostly in the post-consumption time, when you have met your all, needs, let's say physical need, your material need, all the need, then you go towards understanding who I am, what is the meaning of life. So in that sense, in very classical, popular Marxist sense, Buddha could also become Buddha because he consumed the life, he over-consumed, the resources or the luxury and the life, and therefore he, somehow, started to finding the meaninglessness in a life, and therefore he led to another path, unlike the other kings and the prince. So, okay. So this consumption of Buddhism, which focus on meditation and fetishization of the concept of self, has also gained popularity among upper caste Indians, mostly corporate. Even if you visit the corporate gatherings, this HR, they keep the meditation for 1 hour, 2 hours for their, employees. And then the Buddha is there. And you see Buddha is now everywhere. The man who, on the dinner table, the husband, wife and children sit together and abuse Dalits every day on the reservation and many other things, they also do meditation, right? They also have a white Buddha statue in their house or the laughing Buddha, so on and so forth. Okay, so Buddhism has also become the part of a consumption in the modern day, in the post, let's say, if not in the post-ideological, at least in the post-consumption world. So this consumption of Buddhism, as I said, with the focus on meditation and the fetishization of the concept of self, has also gained popularity among upper caste Indians and found a respectable place in the discourse of self-care and self-love. Right? Now, this new discourse that come out, self-care, self-love. For instance, if you, observe this beauty contest, if the winner, they ask the question to this winner, that to this lady, I'm not saying I have actually watched all of this. I used to like all these beauty contests earlier. I used to watch because that was on, because that channel, वो अकेला channel था जो केबल का करंट हमारे घर में आता था. So I used to, that only one channel used to come. So okay fine. So what I'm trying to say, if you ask them कि आपने दुनिया को क्या देना है, what do you have to tell the world? The judges asked to this beautiful lady, so-called beautiful lady. So then she says that I want to tell to all the women out there that believe in yourself. Because I believe in myself, therefore I am here. So now the question of that the most of the women, she is basically trying to say that the majority of women who are not doing well in their life, they are not oppressed because of the structural oppression, but they are punished for not believing themselves. So this is how this entire discourse of believing in self, self-care, self-love has emerged. And this goes very well with the capitalism. You check this advertisement, how this very concept of self or every corporate or industry says that we give the special, unique experience. So now it's the individual and not the collective. And Buddhism concept of self, or understanding self, knowing self, goes very well with this new capitalist vocabulary and this capitalist consumption. So Buddhism in India portrayed as a way of life rather than a religion. seems aligned seamlessly with structural dominance of upper class, upper caste. It is celebrated, it celebrated tenets of non-violence perfectly suits the interests and cognitive balance of ruling liberal elites, from political leaders to corporate figures. Surprisingly, this popular, a passive understanding of Buddhism towards structural socio-economic cultural change has been endorsed by the post-Ambedkar mainstream Dalit Bahujan intelligentsia. Ambedkar, however, rejected the traditional view of Buddhism as merely a way of life and presented it as a systematic religious philosophy for reconstructing the world. Ambedkar went beyond the spiritual mystique associated with the Buddhism, reframing its fundamentals to address the real question posed by Marxism in the external world. He compared Buddha and his religion with Marx and Marxism, presenting a radical political and economic philosophy against structural inequalities and oppression. Moreover, Ambedkar did not simply limit its distinctionness by arguing how scientific Buddhism is compared to other religions in the world, as many scholars have interpreted. But he also presented a radical political as well as economic philosophy of Buddhism against structural inequalities and oppression. The reason to compare Buddha and Marx, even after knowing that these two personalities, this is what Baba Sahib is saying, that the reason to compare Buddha and Marx, even after knowing that these two personalities are divided by such a lengthy span of time and occupied with different fields of thought, was also to recover Buddha from the long-standing passivity towards socio-economic life and inequalities lamented by early Buddhist scholars and organizations in India and in abroad. In his speech on 20th November 1956 at the conference of World Fellowship of Buddhists in Kathmandu, in Nepal, Ambedkar said, there is a dukkha in the world. The word dukkha, no doubt, has been interpreted in various ways. It has been interpreted to mean rebirth, the round of a life, that is dukkha. I do not agree with that. I think there are lots of places in the Buddha's literature where Buddha has used the word dukkha in the sense of poverty. This is what Baba Sahib is saying. That dukkha is not simply the discontent of the mind, or like let's say the individual sadness, or individual this lust of searching truth in the life, but rather for Buddha, Baba Sahib is saying that the dukkha is the, Baba Sahib associates the Buddhist dukkha, where Baba Sahib quotes Buddha himself further, where he says that for Buddha, the larger dukkha was about structural inequalities, the material inequalities, therefore poverty. Thus for Ambedkar, Buddhism was not simply a religion for individual to find happiness in the life, as Dalai Lama keeps talking in his speeches and in his books. But for him, Buddhism in its real sense, it is a religion of social act, a kind of organized force. And this word force is very important in Buddhism, which Baba Sahib also emphasized later. That we somehow, when we talk about Buddhism, we do not talk about force. Force become antithetical to Buddhism. Therefore non-violence. But Baba Sahib, both in Buddha and his Dhamma and Buddha and Karl Marx, and in some of other writing also. For instance, his writing on Bertrand Russell, this principle of reconstruction of society, where Baba Sahib criticized the Bertrand Russell of not using force. But when to use force, he cites the Buddha. Okay, that is another thing. But yes, I was trying to say that the Buddhism, in its real sense, is a religion of social act. That's what Baba Sahib says. A kind of organized force to counter and end the material and social inequalities maintained by the ruling elites. Now, for instance, in this particular time, what is the biggest pressure that if you're, like, for instance, I got opportunity even to work somewhere in corporate, if not exactly corporate, but close to CSR and other people, because I did my master's from TIS. And my friends are mostly in corporates, because I have many friends who are engineers, and then they did their MBA and they're in corporates now. The constant thing that comes from their mind when we sit together is basically this happiness. So happiness is not something that one can achieve, it's a pressure. One has to be happy. So there is a pressure of being happy. You have to be happy. If you're not happy, then but this is not how the life is. That's what the Buddha said, that life is not about this binary between the happiness and sadness. And therefore he goes where even the Nithani talks about that how you counter the nihilism by nihilism, and he says that how Buddhist nihilism is different, and he associates this Buddhist nihilism with where he says it can be argued, with the very concept of shunyata, where you do not have a self itself. The very concept of self itself is antithetical to the Buddha understanding. That's what Nithani says, and many other Buddhist scholars also says. What Osho says, Osho does not have a consistency. Osho is one of the poor intellectual that we have produced when it comes to Buddhism. Osho have misread, Osho is some, see the very beauty, the very beauty of Osho, that the Osho emerged in a time where India also witnessed the tiny, section, mostly from upper caste and the liberals, who wanted to see the life beyond the everyday, routine. And the Osho became Osho because he also served the population who were fed up with the everyday life, the material consumption. Now they wanted to understand something beyond this, beyond the Pepsi, beyond the Coca-Cola, beyond the pizza. They wanted to understand the mystique of a self, and therefore Osho emerged, right? Because I have read Osho. I was a student of psychology. I have read Osho from my graduation. I read Osho in Marathi, Hindi, and also in English. So I don't find the consistency. Osho says, the one basic line that one can define, that Osho defined himself when he says, "Jo acha bhogi hai, wo acha tyagi hai." So Osho is someone who believes that if you do, unless and until you do not consume the life at an extent, you cannot become a tyagi. You cannot live that. Now this very particular principle, this is how even Buddhism stand against this. Buddha does not say that you exhaust everything and then go and search the truth. This is not how even the society can function. If just imagine that you exhaust everything and then you go for a search of a truth, or what your mind, or what is yourself, this is not how the society can function. Even in the material sense or in economical sense, society cannot function like that. So therefore this exhausting all the resources, like what Osho says, that jo acha bhogi wo acha tyagi hai, this can only, this is relevant to only tiny, class, and that is mostly in India the upper class, upper caste. Baba Sahib even saw the most popular non-violence philosophy of Buddhism misunderstood in quite dogmatic ways. For Ambedkar, the role of a force to reconstruct society is an inseparable part of Buddha's religion. Ambedkar in this context, in his Buddha or Karl Marx wrote, the Buddha is generally associated with the doctrine of ahimsa. That is taken to be the be all and end all of his teaching. Hardly anyone knows that what Buddha taught is something very vast, far beyond ahimsa. The Buddha was against violence, but he was also in the favor of justice. And where justice is required, he permitted the use of force and therefore violence in popular sense. A man who fights for justice and safety cannot be accused of ahimsa. If all the means of maintaining peace have failed, then the responsibility for ahimsa falls on him who starts the war. Now this is a different Buddha that Baba Sahib presenting. This is not a Buddha which Gandhi or Nehru would like to see, right? Where Dalits are getting beaten up, where the poorest of the poor are being plundered, or like the very concept that in whatever situation we need to maintain a law. Someone has come, looted my village, destroyed all houses from my community, and now someone, the educated man, coming and telling me from my community we have to maintain law and order, right? So this is, and then they associate this with the Buddha, that how Buddha changed the world without the use of force, without the use of violence. Now Baba Sahib does not say this thing. Baba Sahib says no. Buddha says that you are supposed to use the force when it is required, and especially when you have not started the war. Therefore you have all the right, and therefore and this is not about and this is not about the legalities. Here the matter of using a force is also the matter of morality, right? For a community. For a lawyer, maybe it's a legal thing, but for a community, it's a question of a morality. Because you see, the entire community is defenseless. And therefore, if you read Baba Sahib's defense of Samta Sainik Dal, where the upper caste criticized Baba Saheb and his organization Samta Sainik Dal for using a force to protect, scheduled caste community that time. They said, look at this Samta Sainik Dal, these people are violent. And there Baba Saheb replied to them that he said that I don't understand this concept of ahimsa. I mean, he says that the ahimsa doesn't mean, that the weakness. That he says that if it is required, you are supposed to use the force. And therefore, Samta Sainik Dal was not simply to give, protection to the leaders. Now, what mostly Samta Sainik Dal organization they do? They come and give protection to leader, but the Samta Sainik Dal was meant to protect the community, not simply one individual leader. And that was the real motive. And therefore, you just see there is a physical training, there is a mental training, and there is a morality. This is how the Samta Sainik Dal was, that's how the Baba Saheb constructed this entire notion of having our own defense, let's say, militia for that matter, who has a responsibility to defend by using a force. And not like this middle class, upper middle class Dalit who keep saying that, or when they talk about Buddha, they mostly talk about non-violence. But they don't make difference between the non-violence and the force. Therefore, Buddhism, as mentioned above, for Ambedkar stand against both the spiritual fetishism and the passivity. It, however, for Ambedkar is a religion of oppressed masses to create collective consciousness. And this collective consciousness I am consciously using from the Durkheim. So this to create collective consciousness against structural oppression and to claim equality. Furthermore, this claim for equality for Ambedkar, specifically in the context of India, is also a historical claim, as he saw the history of India, Indian lower caste and Brahmin upper caste is a history of conflict between Buddhism and Brahminism. Ambedkar in this context, revolution, counter-revolution, that the popular statement that we know, stated that the Indian history is nothing but the history of mortal conflict between Buddhism and Brahmanism. In this sense, he saw Buddhists, therefore lower caste, as the first religious other for Vedic Brahmin Hindu ideology. Now, that time there was no word Hindu, as Baba Saheb also argues, but now just to make it understand. So, Buddhists were the first religious other. Now you have the other, which we know the Muslims, for the larger Hindu or Hindutva, let's say what they call fascism. So there is a Muslim, is this significant other or the evil other. That time it was Buddhism or Buddhist. Baba Saheb said that therefore Buddhism is, and now when Baba Saheb actually presented this, and many Dalit writers, specifically in Maharashtra and in Hindi in Uttar Pradesh and in Punjab, when they started writing Buddhist history and associating Buddhist history with the lower caste, many Marxist scholars started saying, no. Ambedkar was not a historian. He simply, constructed identity, and this is something artificial. And this went for really, really long. They presented, like for instance, D.D. Kosambi presented the history of ancient Indian history mostly through the materialist lens, that how the material condition helped to rise the Buddhism, and how the material condition also led to decline of the Buddhism. But later on, lastly, the one Marxist scholar, D.N. Jha, who in his last book somehow, now not somehow, but in very bigger way, wrote that how there was a real conflict, and the real conflict was between the Buddhism and the Brahminism. And then he also talked about how the Buddhist temple got the Brahmins and the Brahmin ruler, how they destroyed the Buddhist religious sites and the temples, all of that. So, so there is a trajectory. When Baba Saheb said he was not historian, but when D.N. Jha is saying, he becomes a historian. That is also, this is how the Indian academics also function. So Ambedkar in his text Revolution and Counter-Revolution, while detailing the history of destruction of Buddhism by Brahmins and Brahminism, stated that Indian history is nothing but the history of mortal conflict between Buddhism and Brahminism. In this sense, as I said, he saw Buddhists, therefore today's lower caste, as the first religious other for Vedic Brahmin Hindu ideology. Even the very practice and the idea of untouchability which makes Indian stratified society unique than the other stratified society in the world, Ambedkar argued, was a result of contempt for earlier Buddhists and Buddhism. by Brahmins. Now, therefore, many Marxist scholars failed to explain, and Baba Sahib quoted in his Who Were the Untouchables, that it is simply about the material degradation, or it is simply about the material condition. Then why in other societies where the lower classes, anthropologically speaking, Baba Sahib cites many anthropologists in his time, the popular anthropologists, that in many societies you see the stratification, you see the defeated tribes also. That one tribe have defeated another tribe and now they are controlling them. But why untouchability basically evolved and emerged in India? Why? And therefore, and the material explanation, like most of the Marxist kind of, the Indian Marxist material explanation basically kind of failed to answer this question. And Baba Sahib said it is because the contempt for Buddhism. Therefore, he says that today's untouchables, they were the earlier Buddhists, and therefore there was a contempt for Buddhism. And then he also explained that why Brahmin had a contempt for Buddhism. And Baba Sahib wrote this thing many times, said many of his speeches. Again, the Marxist scholar said Baba Sahib was simply constructing the identity because he was someone, the practitioner of identity politics according to them. But when Diyenja said the same thing again, Diyenja also said the same thing. That why the Brahmin or the Brahminism became, the strongest opponent of Buddhism, because, and why they developed this contempt for Buddhism. Because Buddhism as a system of values and also the system of a society became very dominant. And Brahmins started losing their status in the society. Right? And therefore he also talks about that how the very concept of why Brahmin live, beef eating. So Baba Sahib says because Buddha simply said you should not slaughter animals if you have the enough resources to feed yourself, and therefore you should not sacrifice animal. And he did not differentiate between the animals, that the cow is pure or the goat is impure, not like that. But somehow Brahmins, they make this just to prove that if Buddhists are 100% so-called ethical or pure, then how can Brahmin sustain? So Brahmin needs to show or pretend that they're 200% pure. So they say that you will not, the cow slaughter became, this kind of, they kind of started saying that one should not eat cow, or they stopped the beef eating. Therefore, other also stopped the beef eating, all of that. Baba Sahib explained it, and even Diyenja later in his writing explained. Now what I'm trying to say, okay, yes. For Ambedkar, therefore, the original religion of lower caste is Buddhism, which he argues is based on liberty, fraternity, and equality. And to reclaim the glorious Buddhist past, on the contrary to the individual choice or desire to seek spiritual salvation, Ambedkar saw the importance of mass conversion into Buddhism. And this mass conversion again is very important. Baba Sahib again and again, when he converted in 1956 in Nagpur, he had a plan to convert people in Chandrapur, and then he was also planning to have a mass conversion across in India. Now this mass conversion is very important. Therefore, if Buddhism is simply about the spiritual search or the individual discontent, then you don't need a mass conversion. That's what for instance upper caste don't need to convert into Buddhism. They can simply consume Buddhism at home. Have a Buddha, have a meditation, and all of that. Have a Dalai Lama, right? So for them, or even for upwardly mobile Dalits, it's not important. But for poor people, or like for Baba Sahib, for Prabuddha Bharat, the majority of Buddhists is very important, because what he's trying to say, that India was a Buddhist state. He says that the India was a Buddhist state, there was a Buddhist majority, which according to him became minority because of the Brahmin onslaught on Buddhism. And to reclaim and spread of Buddhism, he emphasized the active role of monks, the organized efforts of Buddhist organization and seminaries, and the role of common followers. While scholars have mostly interpreted his conversion into Buddhism merely as an attempt to escape from caste Hindu oppression, Baba Sahib Ambedkar posed Buddhism in direct confrontation with the Brahminism and in today's Hinduism. Therefore, you see his 22 oaths that Ambedkar prescribes to his follower. For instance, So yes, the 22 oaths that Ambedkar prescribed to his followers during the conversion ceremony at Nagpur, 1956, capture his intent to reshape Buddhism as a counterforce to the hegemonic ruling caste class ideology and lay down a new path for lower caste to real Ghar Wapsi. Okay. So oaths like I shall not consider Brahma, Vishnu and Mahesh as a god, nor shall I worship them. I shall not consider Ram and Krishna as a god, nor shall I worship them. Now, very interestingly, I was in Mumbai and one of my educated Buddhist, upwardly mobile Dalit friends said, we should not recite these oaths in public. You know why? I have many upper caste friends and they will get, and he's right. He's very, right, because he's working in so-called diverse place where there are many people and he somehow got his position there. Now, if he says something like that, so-called Hindu will get, disheartened or they will not like it, right? Now, for him to be politically correct, it's very important to not, that he is not supposed to recite these oaths. And I agree with him also. I do not, want to frame him that he's not radical or he's this or that. What I'm trying to say, but for a mass conversion, or for Baba Sahib to present Buddhism as a counterforce is very important. Therefore, what the most populist understanding of Buddhism which mostly come from upwardly mobile, so-called intellectual Dalits, is a wrong understanding of Buddhism, and mostly the understanding of Buddhism which Baba Sahib wanted to present to us. Okay, so yes, therefore, so these oaths do not become important for individual. But these oaths become, or these 22 oaths become very important for the mass conversion or for the collective struggle. These oaths clearly exhibit Ambedkar's socio-political engagement with Buddhism in the form of ideology, and more so his reinvention of Buddhism as a collective consciousness for lower caste communities. Therefore, understanding Ambedkar's idea of Prabuddha Bharat and translating it simply as an enlightened India renders passivity to Ambedkar's radical Buddhism and his historical claim for lower caste Buddhist Rashtra nation. Thank you very much. Jai Bhim, Namo Buddhaya.